Welcome to RAFF, R-A-F-F 6205. This is week number 7. We're going to be talking about in vitro diagnostic devices, medical device reports, and then we'll wind up talking a little bit about recalls. I'm delighted to be back with you again. I'm so glad you've tuned in to this lecture, and I hope that you benefit from it. So let's cue up our slides and go to work. In that context, I want to remind you that midnight on June the 14th is your deadline for your legal evaluation and analysis paper. And you'll notice on the slide in this bullet point, I've emphasized that it is to be accompanied by an annotated bibliography. And an annotated bibliography is a very different animal than a straight bibliography. So be sure that your paper has a bibliography and that it's annotated. And then just another reminder that you will be invited by GWU very soon to evaluate this course. And I'd implore you to take advantage of that invitation and evaluate this course. Tell us what can be done to improve it, what worked and what didn't, and we take those reports into consideration. I received maybe 10 days ago the evaluations from two earlier courses, so I'm looking forward to your evaluation. So let's go to work and talk about in vitro diagnostic devices, which are the workhorse of healthcare decision-making in our country, in vitro and other diagnostic tests. And there's ever so many of them, and they're both technologically and clinically diverse, leading to the very real fact that there are several unique regulatory pathways for approval, and one of those is as a laboratory developed test. There is a policy shift occurring as we speak within FDA. It is moving from enforcement discretion, and you know that that means that the foot is not on the accelerator pedal, but it's the feet are on the floor. And that's going to be changing from cruise and off any kind of movement to active regulation. The timetable is not clear, but you want to be alert for that so you're not surprised. In vitro devices are statutorily defined, and I've put in this slide the specific 201 sub H subparagraph of the Act, and I've quoted the language, and I've highlighted in that language the use of the words in vitro reagent and the bolding and putting in italics and underlining the use of the word diagnosis. I follow that by a cite to the Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations subsection where you can look at that definition. And I highlighted the use of the word diagnosis as a cue to me to tell you or remind you that courts broadly, and I emphasize the word broadly, interpret diagnosis or the word diagnosis, and the courts often defer to FDA's interpretations, subjecting a device to its regulation. As we move forward in talking about in vitro devices, we need to remember that words count in the FDA environment. And one of the proofs of that statement is the rule that applies when we're talking about whether or not a device is an in vitro diagnostic device. And one of the ways that the FDA makes that determination is to look at the objective intent of the manufacturer, the words and images the manufacturer uses, and the FDA will take those words and images for what they're worth and from them determine the intended use. And the example I want to give you and have you think about is a bicycle that is described in one way as a bicycle and in another way as a cardiac rehabilitation bicycle. And you can see how important the words are in classifying a cardiac rehab bicycle against a plain old bicycle, if there is any difference. Next week, you and I are going to be talking about labeling and branding and those kinds of concepts. So the importance of the intended use is critical in this area. A kind of diagnostic device can be something that's developed in a laboratory, and they're called laboratory developed tests, and they're usually come out of a single lab, and typically they'll involve genetic tests, predictive tests, tests for rare conditions, and companion diagnostics. And the FDA has been all over the place on LTDs. You'll find evidence of aggressive enforcement and then enforcement discretion. So they're all over the place. It's checkered. In terms of in vitro devices, the FDA's got currently several approaches it's using, and one of them is to issue warning letters, and it recently issued a series of warning letters to LabCorp, the Laboratory Corporation of America, objecting to its OvaSure test, a warning letter to 23andMe, a direct-to-consumer genetic test, and another one is Innova Genomics Laboratory relating to its, and this is a difficult word to pronounce because it's got so many syllables, is a pharmacogenomic test. And I butchered that word, but and I apologize. And right now we're in the season of several controversial draft FDA guidances in this area. Now, FDA believes labs shouldn't provide certain kinds of information unless the claim has undergone successful review. Now, that's the warning letters. Now, the second bullet point here, it has come to our attention letters, is an informal communication from FDA, and what it's doing is instead of sending a formal warning letter, it'll write a letter saying, we invite you to consult with us about the device under consideration. And another approach, an even more informal approach, are emails also inviting a consultation. So whether you get a warning letter or it has come to our attention letter or an email asking you to consult, you ought to do so and keep your eye on the pending FDA guidances. I want to talk a little bit about certain specific products, and the first is the analyte-specific reagents, and that's had been the topic of a rule since 1997. And what these are reagents that are building blocks for assays developed by labs. And I've put the citations in the third bullet point. The ASRs have very complex definitions and exclusions from rules, and the regulations limit entities to which manufacturers can sell them. I want to move forward to research use only products. It's a separate regulatory category. It's not intended for diagnostic purposes and thus are not classified as medical devices. not subject to device requirements, but they are highly regulated. Similarly, there are investigational use only products, and they're by definition to be used only in clinical investigations, and that investigation can include gathering data other than sensitivity and specificity. For example, demographic data to support reference ranges or characterize performance. And there are some labeling requirements for investigational use only products. An interesting, I think, topic is drugs of abuse screening tests. And the FDA takes the point that drugs of abuse screening tests are devices that require pre-market review, except if those drug of abuse tests are intended for forensic use in law enforcement settings. And there are some exemptions that are not available in situations that are not law enforcement, like in home, workplace, insurance, or sports settings. And FDA strongly and vigorously defends its position that drug of abuse tests are devices. It has issued warning letters that marketing drugs of abuse tests without FDA clearance or approval is a violation of the Act, so beware. Another category before we move into medical device reports is general purpose reagents. They're in class 1, they're 510K exempt, and they're pretty much exempt from QSR requirements except for record keeping and complaint handling if it doesn't make sterility claims. And of course, it must meet MDR and correction and removals requirement. So that's a peek at in vitro diagnostic devices. So I want to move to our second topic of today's discussion, and that's medical device reports. It's covered in Section 519 of the Act, and it applies to manufacturers, importers, and distributors. I've put the Title 21 reference in there for you, and what medical device reports are intended to do is to capture information about deaths, serious injuries, and serious malfunctions of devices. And there was a piece of legislation in 1990 called the Safe Medical Devices Act that added user facilities as reporters and eased a little bit the burden on distributors, and it also defined serious injury. So one of the things that we need to remember about medical device reports is that they require internal, very strict MDR procedures. And what those procedures are, and these are written by the organization, subject to regulation by the FDA, those procedures need to focus on identifying, communicating, and evaluating MDR events like deaths, injuries, or some kind of adverse event. So your procedures need to identify, communicate, and evaluate those events, including device complaints. So as those procedures are written, they need to be standardized so the same review process is applied regardless of its circumstance, and then there needs to be a timely transmission of that report to the FDA. I'll talk a little bit later about the applicable deadlines. And you absolutely have to remember that the MDR procedures need to specifically address the company's documentation and record-keeping protocols. And then having said all that, everything that you do with regard to MDR procedures is to be kept separate from all other procedures to preserve their integrity, because these are very serious reports that are used both by the public and the FDA. and they're going to be used by you as an organization. So let's talk a little bit, now that we know what the procedures are, about how they're going to be reported. And they're going to be reported by and large electronically. Now, users may still use paper, and there are still some exemptions available to users and importers. But what will happen is that the information in an FDA form will be sent to the FDA, and that form specifies the needed MDR information and the several types of reporting codes. For example, manufacturers, users, and importers must include patient and device codes. In addition, manufacturers need to submit evaluation, method, result, and conclusion codes. One of the possible difficult parts of MDR reporting is identifying a reportable event. And here's where being aggressive and proactive can be helpful to the organization, and to take as reportable any complaint that's filed. And a complaint can be any kind of communication that alleges a deficiency related to identity, quality, durability, reliability, safety, effectiveness, or performance. Now, that communication can be a phone call, a written correspondence, a letter, a fax, an email, sales rep reports, service reports, scientific literature, internal analyses, or legal documents. Any communication that alleges a deficiency of a certain kind is a complaint, and that information must be evaluated on receipt and reported to the FDA. And if that report is sent but it's incomplete, when it becomes complete, a supplemental report needs to be filed with the FDA. We talked about the procedures and the necessity for keeping separate those procedures. Well, the same rule applies to MDR files. Keep them separate, clearly identify them, include all the event information, all the MDR forms and other information sent to FDA, and copies of electronic acknowledgments. And then you want to have at least a 2-year minimum retention period for MDR files. And since so much of it will be electronic, you know my advice is to just keep them, because space in our computers is dirt cheap. So let's talk a little bit about reporting deadlines. Manufacturers have 30 days after they become aware of the event, 5 days if the report indicates remedial action needs to be taken to prevent unreasonable risk of substantial harm. 30-day rule for importers, users, at least within 10 days after serious injury, and then there are annual reports to be filed. Distributors have a little bit different situation. They're not required to report MDRs to FDA, but they do have to maintain complaint files, which must have information in them about deficiencies in the devices. Now, just as with almost every other area in the FDA, there are multiple exemptions, variances, and alternative reporting. For example, licensed practitioners who manufacture or import devices for use in diagnosing or treating their own patients is either exempt, or they can ask for a variance or an alternative reporting pathway. Manufacturers of devices intended solely for research or teaching are exempt, as are dental or optical labs. And if there's an exemption granted, FDA can condition it requiring that required reports are indeed submitted to the FDA. Alternative permitting allows manufacturers to report malfunctions quarterly for certain devices in summary forms. One thing you always want to remember is that MDRs are subject to public disclosure, and FDA has disclosed and will disclose all MDRs that are submitted, and they're available by a public database. In fact, you'll see in your resource material in this week's Blackboard materials a link to the FDA database where you can get disclosure of MDRs. The other thing that's available is the manufacturer and user facility device experience. That's edited somewhat because FDA will delete certain identifying or proprietary information before that information is made public. From an FDA issue and compliance perspective, always remember that MDRs are not an admission of guilt. Submitting an MDR is not necessarily an admission that the device or the company or its employees caused or contributed to the reportable event. That's right out of the federal rules. And I put that in this second bullet point item, and it's got a curious format for a federal rule. It's a Q&A. When I submit a report, does the information constitute an admission? And the answer is no. And you can read at your leisure the concept that I've already related to you. And that brings up a bullet point underlined, italicized, bolded, and in red, that's a reminder to both of us that this is an FDA strategy and guideline. So what you ought to do is, if you're going to submit an MDR, include language in the MDR saying that it does not constitute an admission that the device, the company, or company employees caused or contributed to a reportable event. Now, having said that, just because you say that doesn't mean that it won't come back to haunt you, but at least you've got a placeholder to make an argument, and perhaps you'll carry the day. There will be instances where voluntary reports are involved, and if so, they need to be evaluated to determine if they're reportable, and they may need to be additional information obtained, and when it's all gathered, it should be evaluated and the decision made just the same way you would for a complaint. And there's the form and the rule on when it happens with multiple devices. The user submits one and the manufacturer should submit also. There are a couple of series of reporting codes. I mentioned codes earlier. One source is the MedWatch Medical Device Reporting Code Manual, and then the FDA has patient and device codes. The Voluntary Malfunction Summary Reporting Program, it's where manufacturers submit quarterly reports, and if there's a recall involved, the voluntary reporting program is prohibited. So that's a little bit about medical device reporting. Now let's close with one of the most popular and well-known features of the FDA, and that's recalls. And when the truth be known, most of the recalls are self-imposed by manufacturers, and that will happen when a manufacturer becomes aware of a quality problem with a marketed device. They'll probably learn about it from a sales report or a consumer complaint, but the manufacturer will, if it's appropriate, will voluntarily recall the device or the drug or whatever it is. And it may be required to report the recall to the FDA. And I put here the federal rule citation for you. Let's take a look at what a recall actually is. It's the firm's removal or correction of a marketed product that appears to be in violation of the FDA Act. And what recall is a synonym for removal or correction. And I put that citation for you in the third bullet point. When we drill down in the definition of correction, we see ever so many dimensions. Correction can be a repair, a modification, an adjustment, a relabeling, destruction, or an inspection without physical removal. There's a couple of kinds of recalls, firm initiated, and I mentioned that at the start of this part of the lecture. Usually a recall is initiated by the manufacturer, and the FDA may issue a mandatory recall, and it's reserved for urgent situations, but the FDA will usually give the manufacturer a heads up. So if the FDA is going to get involved, it's got some steps and to go through. It has to determine that the product presents a risk of illness or injury or gross consumer deception, and there's not been a manufacturer or a marketer recall, and the public needs to be protected, and it needs to be an urgent situation. Now, FDA will give an opportunity to conduct a voluntary recall, failing which it will act. The FDA's mandatory recall authority is triggered on a reasonable probability test, that it's reasonably probable that there will be a serious adverse health consequence or death, and that will invoke the FDA's action to immediately cease distribution and immediately notify health professionals and device user facilities of the order and to instruct to cease its use. And it may not require a recall if doing so would present greater risk than leaving the device in place. And I put the site down here for you. FDA identifies potential recalls, and the manufacturers do, by tracking and trending metrics, looking at complaints and adverse events, service records. Manufacturers will conduct health hazard evaluations and health risk assessments, and manufacturers can determine and then implement correction or removal remedies if quality is the issue. An FDA recall will terminate when it determines that reasonable efforts to remove or correct have occurred and there's been proper disposition or correction. I want to close with a familiar theme in these lectures, and those are exemptions. Often manufacturers or importers will improve the performance or quality of a device that doesn't reduce a risk of health, and they call it a device enhancement. It falls under the category of actions such as market withdrawals, routine servicing, and stock recoveries. And if they fall in those categories, those actions are exempt from reporting. And it and other exemptions are very hotly debatable. about whether or not a recall or correction or removal or device enhancement needs to be reported. Now, device enhancement is not defined in the Act or by the rule, but there is a definition. Now, a guidance definition is not a statute and it's not a rule. It's simply your friendly agency whispering in your ear about what it believes the law is. So that's a overall 30,000 feet view of in vitro diagnostic devices, medical device reporting, and recalls. Next week, we get into what I call the soft underbelly of the FDA. We're going to be talking about labeling, advertising, and promotion. Get ready for next week's lecture, which I think you're going to enjoy very much. It was good being with you, and I'll see you next week.